Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome all of you to the School of Education's Doctoral Student Colloquium Series presentation. I'm Dr. Kristen Betts, and I'm going to be the faculty moderator this afternoon. The Doctoral Student Colloquium Series offers the School of Education doctoral students an opportunity to share their original research and learn from their peers, faculty, and staff. Each month, one EDD and one PhD student presents their research at the colloquium, which is normally offered both on campus and at Drexel University, as well as online through Zoom. However, due to COVID-19, the global pandemic, all of the colloquium events for 2021 through 22 academic year will be held virtually via Zoom. These sessions help doctoral students to connect with each other and develop a peer community that is invaluable in supporting their journey in the program. Each doctoral student presenter is also asked to write a research brief that relates to his or her presentation, which is then included in an edited publication titled Doctoral Student Research Briefs. It's published on the School of Education's website. The research brief is a wonderful way to disseminate our doctoral students' research as shared in the colloquium in a concise format with relevance to education. So today, each presenter will be provided 20 minutes to share their research. We'll then move on to question and answers following each presentation. Please save your questions for the end of each presentation. You're welcome to type questions in the chat area of Zoom. You can use your mic to ask the questions. We hope that you are actively engaged in the session. Our first presenter today is Karena Escalante. She is a PhD student in the School of Education. Karena Escalante is a Philadelphia-based doctoral student at Drexel University's School of Education. Originally from Sonoma, California, she earned her BA in psychology from Grinnell College and her master's from Johns Hopkins University. As a graduate assistant in the Justice-Oriented Youth Joy Lab, her research entails community-based urban and youth studies to advocate for collective leadership practices. After teaching in Hawaii for several years, she found her passion in emancipating Indigenous perspectives through education, specifically for English language learners. She seeks to produce research that is ethically moral, celebrating diversity and illuminating cultural relevance within the education system. As a woman of color and first-generation PhD candidate, Karena also serves on the Diversity Advisory Council at Drexel University. She describes herself as a passionate decolonial ethicist committed to advancing sustainable equity through dismantling systems of oppression within academia. Today, Karena will be speaking about where's the reciprocity, advocating for Marshallese COFA migrants in Hawaii. So I'm going to pass this over to Karena. Please hold your questions to the end, and we'll be excited to have Karena answer them.
Yay, thank you so much, Dr. Betts, for your enthusiasm and introduction. Can you guys see my slides okay?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Let's see if I can minimize this and get a timer just in case, because I could talk. Okay, so hi everybody. I'm going to try to be mindful of the chat, but I won't have the videos active. As Dr. Betts mentioned, my name is Karena Escalante, and the title of this presentation is Where's the Reciprocity? Advocating for Marshallese COFA migrants in Hawaii. And let's get started. Before we go into the actual colloquium, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the indigenous land that our university operates upon. This land is indigenous to the First Nation of Lenape, and we just take a moment to be mindful and honor the space and recognize the links between our research as an institution and the enduring relationship with Indigenous peoples who who are present to this day. So I'm going to take 5 seconds just to show our appreciation for their space. Okay, thank you for that. Um, so a little bit more background information about me. Um, in terms of research, I'm early in my research career, but I consider myself a critical researcher in assessing the purpose and what constitutes knowledge, who constructs it. In my opinion, I believe it's subjective. I believe we all do. In this co-construction of knowledge, we all operate in a certain time and space that we were born into, and that mitigates our sense of reality. I also am a large advocate for the funds of knowledge, believing that knowledge is housed in the cultural relations that we're surrounded by. And when we tap into them, we can really strengthen our research abilities and collaborative measures that we use to strengthen the communities we live and operate in. As Dr. Betts mentioned, I taught in Hawaii for 5 years, right after getting my undergrad. I taught high school English, and I was a ELL coordinator, which is English language learners. So I coordinated the ELL programming for my school, grades 7 through 12. Here in these pictures, you can see some of my formal students who are from the Marshall Islands, and I'm going to be talking a lot about the history of their nation. But Hawaii in itself is a um, very diverse state in the United States. It's home to numerous languages. The ELL population serves, on top of Hawaiian and Samoan, Ilocano, Tagalog, which are languages in the Philippines, and Marshallese and Chukis, which you could see some of my students here, they have distinct features in their face from Micronesia, but they've migrated over to Hawaii due to political reasons over the last 30 years or so. And as an outsider from Los Angeles coming to teach this group, I learned to develop strong relationships with my students, engaging in performances and learning about their culture. But it wasn't until I spent a few years there that I realized there's a lot of traumatic political history influencing them as well. And so the purpose of this presentation is hopefully to document the political climate that shows the relationship that the United States has with the Marshall Islands, propose an Indigenous research lens for the Marshallese to establish multicultural spaces, but specifically within Hawaii's Department of Education, but throughout the nation and serving students that are non-native English speakers. Like to impact educational practices. We're going to take a look at this COFA political document and how it impacts the educational experience of Marshallese students. And that my hope is that this presentation is fueled by decolonial aspirations while still grounded in the indigenous research of people who live in the larger Oceania. So let's keep moving. There is some important background knowledge that sets up the context of the Marshall Islands. So looking at this map, the Marshall Islands is here on the right-hand side. It's close to other states that colonizers have named Micronesia. A former settler in the 1500s from Spain named John Marshall named the Marshall Islands. However, prior to that, for thousands of years, the Marshallese were living off of the land, fishing. They're known for weaving. They can navigate the oceans using their canoes and the stars without modern technology. So a very smart, very indigenous cultured people. And understanding the traumatic political history of the RMI, the Republic of Marshall Islands, will show how the US had an aggressive hand in forcing their immigration. In 1954, the largest nuclear test of nuclear weaponry was tested on the Marshall Islands on behalf of the US military. There was one bomb in particular named Castle Bravo, and it was 1,000 times larger than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima after World War II. So 1,000 times larger. This resulted in relocating the local Marshallese indigenous community members. It resulted in toxic radiation that remains till this day. Um, Today, the Marshall Islands has the highest levels of radiation on the globe. And the bomb and weaponry that the United States military utilized to advance their military agenda is still leaking oil, contaminating their fish, contaminating their way of life, and has ultimately debilitated this indigenous people. The United States in 1986 wrote the COFA, the Compact of Federal Association, which is basically a political statement that says, as a form of reparations, we came in, we bombed your land, we contaminated your water. Under this compact, Marshallese people can travel to the United States. They can live here. They are not immigrants. They don't have visas or green cards, but they fall under this unique category of COFA migrants, which allows them to be categorized differently than other immigrants in the United States and receive certain services from the government, like Section 8 housing, a unique health care as a form of reparations. However, under the COFA agreement, the United States still has access to their lands, to their islands, to the military base. So basically, as long as we can keep our base and keep testing our weapons, we will support you financially. And this COFA was renewed in 2004. It's actually up for renewal again in 2024. So these funds will expire in 2023, right around the corner. And that has large implications about whether or not the Marshall Islands will vote to renew this political statement, whether they will make amendments specifying what social and educational infrastructure, like what tangible steps will be done to help the Marshallese be self-sufficient. Because to date, over the last 20 years, they haven't been successful in rebuilding after the radiation and, and toxicity. But in looking at the research, this is because we still lack some of the analysis, research, and support to fill that gap. So a larger awareness is needed to understand their educational experience as a diaspora moving to other states in their indigenous land. All of this research is still pending and underdeveloped. Schools and educators, as a former teacher, I realized firsthand that we need to account for the linguistic and cultural diversity seen in our classrooms, mirrored in our nation. And the way we account for that is by creating multicultural spaces to support them. So that's some of the important literature in the background to set up the context. This number, 2 million, represents how many Pacific Islanders are expected to live in the United States in the next decade. As you can see, over the last 20, 30 years, the amount of COFA migrants in Hawaii has been steadily increasing, right, since that political statement has been renewed. So you have students, children, nieces, nephews, who are being sent over to live in the United States in hopes of better educational access, in hopes of better infrastructure to support the Marshallese. And you see this increase in the numbers. This map represents Marshallese students spread throughout the country in states like Iowa, Colorado, all over the West Coast, California, Oregon. However, the largest amounts are still here in Hawaii and Guam. In looking at the research that currently exists for this population, there isn't a lot. So I've screenshotted a little bit of my searches and looking at this specific population since the COFA has been renewed in 2004. In searching Marshallese identity, academic outcomes, the peer-reviewed journals yield 140 results. And if you look at the titles, these are articles that are talking about maternal health care, the exposure from radiation. So a lot more in the health industry, but not so much in the field of education. This is a search from 1955 to date, so since the Castle Bravo bomb was dropped. We have 259 results for Marshallese and education. However, the articles that come up are still revolved around diabetes, self-management, the diaspora. This search is also, since the compact has been renewed in the last 20 years, 40 results. So I show this just to paint this picture that there is still lacking literature that advocates and gives the Marshallese platform to share their story about the history of their people. We're still missing that here within our own library. Because of that, I propose a participatory epistemology, community-based participatory action research to help understand this unique Indigenous people, their unique history of colonization in relation to the United States. Um, for the methodology, I'll be talking about it on the next slide about talk story and how we can use some of their own cultural values to collect rich data to tell their story um, in hopefully back in Hawaii. So let's take a look at the research questions. The first proposed one is, how do the American educational system, how does the historical experiences of Marshallese students influence their identity formation? What is that experience looking like for students who have moved over due to the tension between the two nations? And then how does the COFA policy agreement impact their education? The Indigenous framework is known as talk stories. So this is a local method of communication, kind of like a healing circle or collective dialogue called Wewanado. And basically it's a relaxed discussion through which both the researcher and participant journey together, visiting places and topics of interest that are deemed relevant. Um, The Marshallese society and their culture has survived without written text for so long. In fact, they are grounded in oral traditions. And Webunato is an indigenous and very important data collection tool that allows two people, a participant, a researcher, two members of the community to come eye to eye. And as the quote says, just explore without expectations, without protocols, without the conditional structure of Western science, but just openly engaging in a dialogue and saying, let's see where this takes us. So I propose Webunato as the center of my framework to really sit and take the time to engage in these rich discussions with the Marshallese about their experiences. For the conceptual framework, I'd like to center it around this idea of talk story. And I've surrounded the framework with three cultural morals of the Marshallese: kindness, respect, and reciprocity. My belief is that legends and stories show these cultural values, and if we can find a way as researchers to meet our communities with their values, then the reciprocity for this research can be fulfilled in a way that's more empowering, in a way that provides assets. As teachers, I would argue, as a former educator, we need all of these. If you're going to, me, a teacher from LA coming to indigenous Hawaiian sovereignty land, I had to understand how to be kind, how to show my students respect, right? And how to earn that reciprocity as opposed to expecting it because of power dynamic. So as a teacher, as practitioners, as researchers, it's critical for us to understand that navigating multicultural, multilingual spaces does require extra effort, extra strategies, extra research to really be to make an effective inclusion of the multiple identities we see present in the classroom. I think by using Webunato and engaging in this rich dialogue, we can empower the Marshallese community to help us develop research tools that are not only relevant for the institutional side, but productive in producing collaboration in the community. The conceptual framework, I'd like to align it with this Indigenous Framework as well of Identity that comes from Goforth et al. 2016, which takes the time to consider the multiple modalities that impact one's culture and identity and how those are linked. Here we see concepts of spirituality, the social behavioral effects, the physical and cognitive, academic, how all of these different facets are influencing the students in our classroom and their learning experience. So while this study is still in the developing stages, my hope is that I can answer these questions using um, using a combined framework of Webwanato and the Indigenous Conceptual Framework. For data collection, um, engaging in the Webwanato talk story.
Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
I'm sorry?
I've been.
Hi, Sharon. No, you're fine. So yeah, I think the talk story and writing first-person narratives of the student experiences could produce rich firsthand accounts, and then not just writing first-person narratives with the high school students, but actually recording them sharing their story in their own voice, and then publishing that narrative in a book could be one way to create pedagogical resources that teachers can then use to, to teach the ELL students in their classroom. When I was an ELL teacher, I did something similar where we read biographies and narratives of students from other parts of the globe, just to compare the culture, to understand different name pronunciations in different regions. I think we could do something similarly for the Marshallese students. After interviewing, after engaging in talk story, to help them write a narrative that can then be published in a book and say, these are immigrant youth voices. And this is material that's culturally relevant. This is pedagogy that can not only enhance their English and learning skills, but ground them in their cultural identity as well. Ultimately, I think this research has the potential to offer counter narratives to the community, to empower the historically excluded Marshallese students in Hawaii, grant more control and agency to the community, and release us an ego as the researcher and give that back by reflecting on some of the socio-cultural and political statements and acts that impact their influence, that impact their educational experiences. When assessing ELs, when assessing students of Indigenous backgrounds, we have to be careful to support and account for some of those differences. And I think finding the bridge between my experiences as a researcher and a teacher and understanding the diversity of students can all come together in an honest, in a culturally humble approach to say, okay, what is it that we can co-construct together? What is it that will be valuable for you and your community? And how can I give you the platform to say what you need to say? So yeah, there are a few considerations. I'm thinking about the language barrier. I'm Latina from LA. I speak Spanish. I don't speak Marshallese. So understanding the additional resources I might need to supplement that, such as translators. The convenience sample, I thought about interviewing former students. However, as an ELL coordinator, I coordinated the entire ELL program for the school, for the district, for the state of Hawaii Department of Education. So I do hold a certain power dynamic with my former students. Whereas if I just come in and meet high school students right now that I didn't have to personally teach, I might be able to avoid some of that hesitation students might have in sharing. The distance is something to consider. I'm now in West Philadelphia since last year. I no longer reside in Hawaii, and I have to consider how can I maintain and strengthen these relationships in a mostly a virtual world now. Considering an ongoing global pandemic, what implications does that have for my research, and how might I need to pivot that to be appropriate? And then lastly, the last consideration is I often feel pressured against the timeline of academia, which is very rigid at times. However, this type of work is actually gradual in developing the trust of a community can take time, maybe much more time than I have left in my dissertation proposal funding. So I have to be mindful of how to balance this delicate dance of serving different institutions and communities. So all in all, I left a little time for discussion. This is still in the developing stages. I'm just second year, I have big dreams, but I wanna shout out the School of Education who financially makes this program possible for me. You could find me housed in the Justice-Oriented Youth Joy Lab with Dr. Ayana, who's been a great mentor. And then the Sisters in Scholarship, which is cohort 7. We are a group of 7 women, and we are fun and funny and feisty. And just want to thank everybody for helping me run this with them. Yeah.
Well, Karena, thank you for such an inspiring and dynamic presentation. You're going to have to come back so we can find out what you discover with your research. So at this point, we are actually going to open up the floor for any questions. If we end up with a lot more questions and we have time, I am sure the speakers will put in their email addresses because the topics are really, really exciting today. So questions for Karena. You can just open up your mic if you would like and just start asking.
Karena, I have a question. Have you considered the possibility of actually spending some time in Hawaii during your dissertation process and actually working with them in that context instead of distance?
Hi, Nisha. Thank you for your question. Yes, I have considered that. I think the more time I spend here in Philadelphia, it's harder, like the farther Hawaii starts to feel. And I know the Office of International Engagement and the School of Ed has some funding available. I mean, I would go tomorrow. I would go yesterday if funding wasn't an issue. So I guess thinking about external funding opportunities to not only get me there, but sustain me there, because I could get there, but then how long would I have to be there? You know, a month, 2 months to engage with students in the community. There are some, I guess, just there's some tangible steps that I would have to address, but I'm definitely open to it. I see a question in the chat. Would you mind explaining the difference between talk story and interviews? Yes. So talk story Wewanato, it's as I mentioned, it's really an open-ended conversation, dialogue that's meant to yield an exploration of words. So when I taught in Hawaii, I had like 1 or 2 teacher friends, and we had the same prep. And she'll say, hey, I'll come 3rd period, I'll bring my coffee, and we'll just sit and talk story. And I knew what that meant. Like, I'll bring the food, you bring the coffee, I'll bring breakfast burritos, and we'll just catch up and we'll talk about students and life and did you buy the house? And no goals, not looking, not expecting anything, but just an open-ended dialogue. And I think that differs from, say, semi-structured interviews or structured interviews in qualitative research and data collection, in that there are certain methods and protocols that structure the interview. So having preordained questions, having maybe a timestamp on, right, we have 30, 45 minutes for this interview. So removing that structure taps into what makes Wewanato an indigenous approach and not just an open-ended interview, a semi-structured interview.
Are there any other questions or any comments before we move on to our next speaker? No, well, there's lots of great comments in the chat. Again, fabulous presentation. So we're going to move on to our second speaker, Dr. Melissa Kaufman, who is an EDD graduate of the School of Education. Dr. Melissa Kaufman is the Director of Academic Innovation for the Dornsife School of Public Health in Drexel University. There, she oversees the school's online programs as well as curriculum development and assessment, including developing new programs and ensuring all programs meet accreditation standards. Dr. Kaufman received her EDD in Education Leadership and Management in September 2021. She has presented at numerous conferences, including the 2020 Quality Matters National Conference, 2020 ASPPH Conference. She has also published articles in the Journal of Health Administration and Education, Journal of Educators Online. In her dissertation, she even got to cite her own research. I encourage all of you to do the same. Today, Dr. Kaufman will be speaking about the effects of adaptive leadership on faculty engagement and online learning in higher education, a mixed methods study. So at this point, I am going to pass the mic over to Dr. Kaufman.
Hi, thanks so much. I'm very happy to be here. And Karena, your research is so exciting and amazing. I can't wait to read about it when you're all done. It sounds so cool. So I'm here today to talk about the research that I did for my dissertation, which was looking at the effects of adaptive leadership on faculty engaging in online learning in higher ed. So just to give a little bit of background, before I started doing this research, I had already kind of established that the higher ed environment is rapidly changing. Students are seeking more flexible and online learning opportunities. And this change, and institutions are also looking at ways to reach those more non-traditional students. And this change was kind of developing already in higher ed in response to the 2025 enrollment cliff, which is basically a population drop in graduating high school students that's anticipated. And then COVID-19 came in and kind of dumped gasoline onto the fire. And students are really looking for increasing flexible and alternative ways to obtain their education. In 2018, 3 million post-baccalaureate students, of the 3 million, 56 were full-time and 44 were part-time. And by 2029, it's projected to, part-time enrollment is projected to increase by 7%, whereas full-time enrollment is projected to remain relatively unchanged. 75% of undergraduate students were classified as non-traditional, meaning among other things, they might go to school part-time, be working full-time, be financially independent, and may have dependent children themselves. So the problem that I was trying to address with this research is that institutions of higher education need to find a way to reinvent themselves and to figure out how to operate in this kind of post-industrial age and now pandemic age, and how to keep their doors open, as many institutions have unfortunately had to close their doors. My research questions were: what are faculty's perception of online learning, both for those who have participated in it and those who have not? What factors influence faculty participation in online learning? And then, does adaptive leadership affect faculty perception and participation in online learning? So my conceptual framework was a pragmatic constructionist frame. Pragmatism looks at the way to address a challenge, and constructivism uses the reality of a situation to shape one's approach. So there's no magical one answer to a challenge or problem and to the challenges facing higher education. And so this study explored the feasibility of one solution, which is online education and institutions' ability to adapt. This research was done using an explanatory sequential design mixed methods approach. And this approach allowed the research to build upon itself. And it also allowed me as a researcher to both be able to present data in that quantitative fashion with kind of hard numbers and statistics, but still preserving the ability to create that narrative and have that deep, rich data that comes from a qualitative approach. And this is my research design. So I started out with my survey, my quantitative data and analysis, and then I did my interview plan, my interviews and analysis. And then I was able to take both types of data and triangulate my results for my interpretation. Go back first. second. So the survey was sent to 352 faculty members at 4 schools and colleges. And then I interviewed 8 faculty members who had taught in the last 3 years, had online or remote teaching experience. And I used a purposeful stratified sample for faculty type, the school, college they were from, and gender. So the participants in the survey, you can see here that the majority of them had taught online for 1 to 2 years, and that the majority of them were clinical or tenured faculty. I also found that they were 61% were female, 58% were white. 61% were over 50, 58% were female, 77% were white, and 82% were non-Hispanic or Latino. And that did align with the demographics of the total population of the university I was looking at. So I felt like that gave me some validity in my sample. So for my data analysis, for the quantitative data, I used inferential statistics to analyze the data and make inferences and connections between faculty demographics and their perceptions of online learning. And then as also with their perception of the school's leadership. These analyses were done using SPSS and a combination of one-way ANOVA and independent sample t-tests. I also did some open hand coding of the text comments left in the survey. For my qualitative data, I used open and axial coding with NVivo to discover my themes and my sub-themes. And then the data were triangulated to produce the results. Okay, so my first result was the climate of a school or college does affect perception of and participation in online learning. And you can see here that I asked questions on the survey about the climate of the school or college. And I found that faculty who strongly agreed that their institution had policies that protect intellectual property rights for digital work, acknowledge time demands for online courses for workload, and appropriately reward contributions to digital pedagogy. There was a statistically significant positive perception of online learning for faculty who also strongly agreed that their institution had these. And then the survey also asked, not only, they asked it at 4 settings, so at any institution, at my institution, in my department of discipline, or in the classes that I teach. And so they're asked that, and as you can see, except for in my department discipline, statistically significant difference was found for faculty who strongly agreed with these statements. The next result was faculty want to be acknowledged and rewarded for participation in online learning. And so this is kind of a breakdown of that question of my institution acknowledges time demands for online courses for workload. So as you can see here, there was statistically significant data that was found in the 4 settings at any institution, at my institution, in my department or discipline, and in the classes that I teach. And looking over here at the effect size, you'll see that the effect size for these were medium or large. So it's not only that a statistically significant difference was found, but the effect size is large. So it was a meaningful difference. The next result was that institutions of higher education looking to move online need to secure faculty buy-in and provide faculty support. So one participant said, if you don't have the buy-in of the faculty, you just don't get things accomplished. Another one said, they have to get faculty buy-in. If that's online learning happening without the faculty buy-in, then you're going to have unhappy faculty. That's so very true. And then another participant said, you really need faculty support. You need training for the faculty and you need time. And then another said, I think that we, to a large extent for digital technology, have strong support, and that support and assistance is so important. And this was echoed across all of the interviews that I did, that folks really found that this was critical for institutions who wanted to move into the online space. So just keep an eye on my time. So then faculty's perception of online learning, the next result is faculty's perceptions of online learning has shifted over time, and shifted perception in a positive direction during online and remote teaching during COVID-19. So I asked on the survey if their perception of online learning had shifted over the last 5 years, and the majority said yes. And then I asked if the teaching remotely shifted their perception, and 64% said yes. And in both of those questions, I asked how their perception had shifted. And they said that it had the overwhelming number of comments where it had shifted in a positive perception. And that's what I did the open hand coding for. So I was really surprised by this. Well, not really surprised, but I was surprised by this result in that teaching remotely increased people's positive perception of online learning. I think it shows that exposure to online and the medium can increase people's positive perception. And then my last result was that instructional design support was highly valued. So one participant said they, meaning the faculty, they need support, and they need, education, and they need instructional designers. And I think that from my personal experience, this has been very true. Faculty sometimes just need that Sherpa, if I can steal from that Inside Higher Ed article, to lead them through the shift to online. Another participant said that it's just really dependent upon the success of online learning. It's really dependent on the faculty and how much they're able to use the resources that are available to them and to work with an instructional designer. And then a survey participant talking about their experience working with an instructional designer said it was excellent. He helped me explore options and gave me the technical help I needed. So recommendations. So my first recommendation is that as much as possible, institutions should allow faculty to opt in to online teaching. Not everybody is going to want to do online, and that needs to be okay. There are folks whose subject matter really just doesn't lend itself to online. Some of the fine arts, really lab-based courses. I mean, you can find a way to do online for almost everything, but there are going to be some folks who are more comfortable in that in-person setting. And there are going to be some folks who are super excited about online and learning this new medium and figuring out a way to reach those students. But by giving folks choice, you kind of eliminate some of that resistance to change, and you also create an environment where people feel happy and positive and supported. The next is to protect faculty time. I think this is really important. Designing an online course is hard. It's a lot of work. And faculty need to have their time protected for that. If they're going to spend 4 to 6 months working with an instructional designer and developing an online course, they should have that time recognized and protected for them. The next is to recognize faculty contributions. Right, so everybody wants to be recognized for the hard work they put in. And so if you have faculty who are moving their courses to an online setting, learning how to teach in a brand new modality, innovating with high flex or hybrid courses, you got to recognize them, put them in your newsletter, give them a special cord at graduation that says these are our online learning excellent faculty. Without taking up too much time, maybe have them serve as a mentor for other faculty who are interested in moving into the online space, but really just kind of show them as an example of like, these folks are doing this amazing job being innovative, moving into this new modality where we know the students want to be, and let's recognize them and praise them. The next one is provide support to faculty. And I think this one is really important because the type of support is important. So it's not just run another workshop on like how to create measurable learning objectives. There are 1,000 of those out there. I'm sure there's a YouTube video on it that people could watch. But what faculty really need is that just-in-time training, that job aid, that coaching, And that's not easy to do, and it's not necessarily resource light, but that kind of support is what folks said they wanted in the interviews and what will really help them be able to move forward. And I also found we piloted a process at my institution where we paid people to do continuing ed, and it was like totally fell flat. I wrote a paper about it, and it just like paying people to take workshops, it didn't work. So it's not workshops that folks necessarily need, it's other kinds of support. And then my last finding was invest in instructional design support, right? Invest in instructional designers and instructional technologists. And actually, EDUCAUSE came out with their top 10 IT issues for 2022 recently, and one of their number 3 issue was digital support for digital faculty. And they said invest in instructional designers, instructional technologists, instructional pedagogists, instructional pedagogy. This is the support that faculty need in order to move into the online space successfully. Faculty should not have to go back and learn how to be an instructional designer or an online learning expert necessarily. If they're an epidemiologist and they are an expert in epidemiology, let them be that expert and then marry that subject matter expertise with that instructional design support, with that curriculum development expertise that comes from staff who have that background. So these are my recommendations. And I hope that institutions are able to take them and listen to them and potentially implement them to see if that increases faculty satisfaction, faculty participation in online learning, and also increase faculty positive perceptions. And I would like to do this research on a larger scale at additional institutions so that it can become more generalizable. So that is my presentation. I kind of weigh down, and then I also talk fast. So we've got lots of time for questions. And thank you so much.
Well, Dr. Kaufman, thank you for that. I know for all the instructors and instructional designers attending this session, the data is really powerful and so important. Are there any questions that you have for Dr. Kaufman? Well, let's do this. If there are no questions, I don't know if you happen to have any comments for one or both of our presenters. I know there's lots of accolades going into the chat area. Fabulous presentation. Very exciting to see how timely the research is as well that you conducted. So what we will do, Jamina, I don't know, Jamina, if you want to jump on and say anything before we wrap up the session. No, okay. Well, then what I'd like to do is, first of all, I have to say, what an exciting colloquium today to have the opportunity to hear from our doctoral students talking about research that they are leading in areas that are so critical to the lives of students, teachers, faculty, communities, truly life-changing. I mean, and we're listening to research that's been completed and going on, current research that's going to continue to evolve. I'd like to thank our presenters, Karena Escalante, Dr. Melissa Kaufman, for presenting today. I'd like to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to attend today's colloquium. The next colloquium event will be on Friday, December 3rd from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in Zoom. And on behalf of the School of Education, we want to wish you all happy holidays coming up in November. And we are looking forward to seeing you on December 3rd. Enjoy your afternoon. Have a fabulous weekend. Thank you for joining us.